Until now, you would have been told about what white women and masters used to do with their black slaves. However, nobody would have told you how the children of the white slave owners, especially the teenagers, used to treat the black slaves. Seeing their parents humiliating black slaves, white teenage boys and girls would think of new ways to beat and humiliate black slaves. Because they had authority, black women, men, and children slaves could do nothing except follow their orders. However, they did not know that white teenagers would have desires and wishes that would make them less than humans. Even if white teenagers had to stay within some limits, when their parents would not be around, they would order their black slaves to do some of the most horrific things. So, what chilling things white teenagers used to do with their black women, men, and children slaves? Let's know about that in this video.
The Black History Archives.
Let's first know how white teenagers treated black male slaves. During the dark era of slavery in the United States, white teenagers, both boys and girls, from families who owned slaves were engaged in a culture that normalized the ownership and exploitation of human beings. This normalization of violence and dehumanization extended to their treatment of family-owned black male slaves, who were subjected to a range of hideous and horrific acts at the hands of their teenage oppressors. In many cases, white teenagers subjected black male slaves to physical abuse and violence as a means of asserting their dominance and control. These acts of brutality could take various forms, including beatings, lashings, and other forms of physical punishment. For some white teenagers, inflicting pain and suffering upon black male slaves served as a twisted display of power and superiority. Because they were teenagers, morality had no standards for them, and pushing all limits of immorality seemed fun for them. Sexual violence and exploitation were also prevalent in the treatment of black male slaves by white teenagers. The intersection of race and gender meant that black male slaves faced unique forms of exploitation, often at the hands of white teenage boys seeking to assert their masculinity and dominance. In addition to physical violence, white teenagers also subjected black male slaves to psychological abuse and degradation. Verbal insults, threats, and intimidation were common tactics used to demean and dehumanize black male slaves, reinforcing their status as inferior beings in the eyes of their teenage oppressors. The labor of black male slaves was exploited to the fullest extent by white teenagers, who viewed them as disposable commodities to be used for their own benefit. These teenagers forced black male slaves to perform grueling and backbreaking labor under harsh conditions, often with little regard for their health, safety, or well-being. Whether laboring in the fields or working in the household, black male slaves were subjected to relentless exploitation and mistreatment at the hands of their teenage owners. White teenage girls would do things with black male slaves that one finds hard to explain. For example, white girls knew they held supreme power over black slaves, even if their status in broader white society was compromised. For them, black slave plantations became their kingdom, where they would get things done as they pleased. It offered an addictive sense of satisfaction, having powerful black male slaves at their disposal. However, that did not seem enough. Then, white teenage girls would try to tease black male slaves, making them struggle to stay away from them by deliberately coming closer. Because white teenage girls were in an immature part of their lives, they would engage in activities that were prohibited. For example, finding no one around, white teenage girls would touch black male slaves. In respect and in fear of getting punished if seen, black male slaves would move away, but this made white girls more addicted to playing. Feeding on black slaves' fear, white girls would try to forget their own fear. Now, let's know how black women slaves were treated by white teenagers, especially white boys. Here's a reminder to please support us so we can make more videos for you by subscribing to our channel and giving the video a like. We want to build a strong community and we need your support. Let's continue now. During the dark era of slavery in the United States, the treatment of black women slaves by white teenagers, both boys and girls, within family-owned households was marked by a disturbing blend of exploitation, abuse, and dehumanization. This period in history reveals the stark realities of systemic racism, entrenched patriarchy, and the brutalities inflicted upon enslaved individuals, particularly black women. In the context of family-owned slavery, white teenagers were raised within a society that normalized the ownership of human beings as property, perpetuating a culture of violence and oppression. Black women slaves, being among the most vulnerable within this system, endured horrors at the hands of their white owners, including teenagers who often inherited the prejudices and privileges of their parents. With the absence of parental supervision, white teenagers were granted unchecked power over their family-owned slaves, exploiting their authority to inflict various forms of mistreatment. Secluded areas such as hidden huts or remote parts of plantations became stages for acts of cruelty, where white teenagers would exercise their dominance over black women slaves. One of the most chilling aspects of the treatment of black women slaves by white teenagers was the normalization of sexual violence and exploitation. In a society where black women were viewed as property rather than human beings, their bodies were subjected to heinous acts without regard for their dignity or autonomy. White teenage boys, in particular, often engaged in sexual experimentation on black women slaves, treating them as objects for their own gratification and amusement. These experiments were characterized by a monstrous disregard for the humanity of black women, who were forced to endure unspeakable horrors at the hands of their oppressors. You should note that here, the term sexual experiments fails to capture the full extent of the suffering inflicted upon black women slaves, whose bodies were violated and commodified in the most degrading manner imaginable. Exploiting them were white teenagers who were perhaps very far away from being humans in the abhorrent immoral acts they were carrying out. You should know that by that time, slave breeding farms had been established where slave breeding was done on a commercial scale. White boys had seen how black women could be abused sexually. Therefore, whenever white boys felt bored, they would head toward the hidden huts in the cotton plantation, take black women with them, and engage in horrific activities. For white teenage girls, the power dynamics were different but no less damaging. While they may not have engaged in overt acts of sexual violence, they often participated in the systemic oppression of black women slaves through complicity and silence. Their privilege afforded them a degree of social status and authority over black women, which they often wielded to maintain the status quo of white supremacy. The intersectionality of race and gender meant that black women slaves faced unique forms of oppression within the institution of slavery. In addition to enduring the brutality inflicted upon all enslaved individuals, they also suffered the indignities of sexism and misogyny, which further compounded their suffering. However, the treatment of black children slaves by white teenagers presented the most horrific sight. The treatment of black children slaves by white teenagers, both boys and girls, within family-owned households during the era of slavery in the United States reveals the depths of cruelty and dehumanization inherent in the institution of slavery. White teenage boys and girls often wielded their power over black children slaves in disturbing ways. With the absence of parental supervision, they were granted free rein to mistreat and abuse black children slaves. The reason white teenagers would wait so their parents would leave is to avoid giving any compensation to black children if their parents objected. They feared their parents would ask them to stop tormenting black children, which they did not want to happen. The chilling acts inflicted on black children slaves included physical violence, verbal abuse, and psychological torment. One chilling aspect of the treatment of black children slaves by white teenagers was the normalization of cruelty and sadism. White teenage boys, in particular, often engaged in acts of physical violence against black children, using them as objects for their own amusement and entertainment. This could include beating, whipping, or otherwise physically abusing black children slaves for perceived infractions or simply for the pleasure of exerting power over them. You should know that black children, from the moment they were born, were deemed slaves. Therefore, in most cases, white teenagers would give orders to black toddlers and those who were under 10. But despite their young age, black children had understood that there was no chance of any resistance. Whatever was said to them should be done at all costs. Otherwise, they could be beaten. Similarly, white teenage girls also engaged in the mistreatment of black children slaves, either through active participation or through their silence and acquiescence to the violence perpetrated by their male counterparts. In addition to enduring the brutality inflicted upon all enslaved individuals, they also suffered the indignities of being vulnerable and powerless in the face of their oppressors. Did you know that white teenagers were equally responsible for wreaking havoc on black slaves? Tell us, who was really responsible? Black slave masters who had taught their children to do horrific things with slaves, or the teenagers themselves? In the comments section right below, share your thoughts on what more white teenagers would make black slaves do just for fun and entertainment. Would you like us to make more videos? If yes, please support us by subscribing to the Black History Archives and clicking the bell icon. You can check out more videos on our channel too.